Thanks, Professor Ganguly, for sharing your wonderful insights on such an important issue of Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, and especially, arranging it in a format which consider its regional impacts. Uh, with this, I would like to go with my first question. Uh, that in recent that Until recently, India Taliban engagements were either through secret channels or open but unofficial. For example, in Moscow in 2018, or they were quiet engagements. For example, ME officials visited Taliban in Doha in June. But recently, Ambassador of India to Qatar and head of Taliban's political office in Doha met in the Embassy of India in Doha. Hence, there is beginning of formal, direct, and public engagement of Taliban. So, in your opinion, does talking to the Taliban mean falling into the trap set by the Pakistani deep state? Or is it a careful engagement with the Taliban that should be done to ensure that there are various influences on Taliban and India's strategic and diplomatic interests are taken care of?
I cannot possibly imagine that serious people in the Ministry of External Affairs who have dealt with Afghanistan over extended periods of time would be so naive as to think that the ISI does not have significant influence over the current government in Afghanistan. They must be acutely cognizant of the risks and the dangers uh, that that exist in any dealings with the Taliban regime or its representatives. I'm sure they have these concerns firmly embedded in the backs of their minds. And one should be extremely circumspect about any formal commitments that the Taliban makes. To quote an American president whom I otherwise loathe, Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, which is the term he used when dealing with the Soviet Union. And I would use that injunction when it comes to dealing with the Taliban.
Okay. Thanks for explaining that question, Professor Ganguly. Then going on to the second question that I would like to ask, that Pakistan is on the grey list of Financial Action Task Force, mainly for terror financing, and in the upcoming days, its support to terror outfits like Lashkar-e-Taiba seems inevitable. So should India put maximum pressure to check Pakistan on this?
Absolutely. India should exert any kind of pressure, multilateral and bilateral, to ensure that Pakistan does not get off the grey list. There is no evidence that I have seen, at least in the public domain, that Pakistan has ended its support for these organizations beyond making cosmetic gestures which amount to little more than a slap on the wrist. Putting Hafiz Mohammed Saeed in house arrest amounts to little or nothing. He's still living in considerable comfort, hardly being denied any creature comfort, and with an ability to communicate with his substantial following. And there is no reason to believe that somehow or other the ISI has turned over to a new leaf. And consequently, every form of pressure should be exerted to ensure that unless Pakistan eschews its ties to terror, that it should remain on the FATF grey list.
Uh, yeah, moving on from that, we have seen recently the interim government formation in Kabul. So, can we say that Taliban has developed, any semblance of foreign policy that is autonomous of Pakistan? And in this light, can New Delhi pursue a dehyphenated Taliban-Pakistan policy?
It's simply too early to tell. I think the next few weeks and months will be quite revealing, but it would be shocking to me to see the Pakistan uh, Taliban nexus somehow rent asunder. Moeed Yusuf, someone I know fairly well, who is the principal foreign policy advisor to Imran Khan, has already sought to rehabilitate the Taliban in his public remarks. This suggests to me that the nexus between Pakistan and the Taliban has it remains as robust as ever, but it will bear watching very closely to see how the relationship evolves and how Pakistan seeks to protect its interests in Afghanistan, and to what extent does the issue of the Tehrik-e-Taliban remains an irritant in the relationship.
Professor Ganguly, my last question to you would be, and I would later even, it will be an honor if Suhasini Heather can answer on this, that while engaging with Taliban, what are the steps being taken by India and other major powers in the region to ensure women's rights and basic human rights in Afghanistan? Why is it that women's right is a question that is always relegated to the margin, and other areas of power politics always take a priority? So yeah, that's.
And I have a small added question. Do you think, there is this book, famous book, Peril, which is coming out, investigative journalist Bob Woodward is bringing that book out, and he's speaking about, the American withdrawal. And they're saying that they've tried to persuade Joe Biden to not withdraw completely. So what is your view on that? Thank you.
Sorry, I missed the first part of your question. For some reason, it was a bit indistinct.
Okay, so there is this book which is coming out. It's called Peril, and there's a famous investigative journalist called Bob Woodward, and he's authored this book that is coming out, and in which he's very convincingly argued that America should, they tried to convince American president not to completely withdraw from Afghanistan. So, what is your view on that? What's your take on that? Should America have withdrawn? And now that it has, what needs to be done by America? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I have not been able to lay my hands on a copy of Peril yet, though I imagine I will before too terribly long. I've read excerpts from the book and I've heard extensive commentaries on the book. Bear in mind, in all fairness, that this decision to withdraw so precipitately was made not by this administration, but by the previous administration. It's Trump who had already set a deadline for withdrawal. And had the United States, in my judgment, stayed on beyond that withdrawal date, American personnel, whether diplomatic or military, would have become targets of the Taliban. And consequently, to some extent, I would argue that Biden's hands were tied by the deal that Zalmay Khalilzad had reached in Doha with the Taliban representatives. And Biden, to some degree, had been boxed in. Now, admittedly, Biden also wanted to withdraw because he had always been in favor of a light military footprint and primarily interested in counterterrorism and not in the reconstruction of the Afghanistan of the Afghan state. And so, and furthermore, I think in my judgment, he correctly felt that this war really needed to be brought to a close, because staying on for another year or another 5 years would not have produced a vastly different outcome. I refer you in particular to a book that a colleague and an acquaintance of mine has written, Carter Malkasian, The American War in Afghanistan, which shows in considerable detail a series of flawed decisions that multiple administrations, regardless of their ideological preferences, made. And in addition to that, I also refer you to the Afghanistan papers by Craig Whitlock, who is a who is a correspondent for the Washington Post, who has managed to collate all manner of unclassified or classified documents under the Freedom of Information Act, which again reinforces what Malkasian says in terms of flawed decisions and choices on the part of multiple administrations that got us to this miserable pass in Afghanistan. And continuing those policies, I don't think would have produced a different outcome. And I don't buy this silly notion that keeping 2,500 troops would have made a material difference in terms of the withdrawal. It might have eased the withdrawal a little bit, it might have facilitated the withdrawal a little bit, but I don't think it would have produced a fundamentally different outcome in terms of the fall of Kabul.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Professor Ganguly, like going back to the last question that I had put forward, that while engaging with Taliban, what are the steps being taken by India and other major powers in the region to ensure women's rights and basic human rights in Afghanistan? And I would also request later Suhasini Heather to comment on that. She has written a lot on that. Yeah, later.
Look, this is one of the most crucial questions. Both the rights of women and the rights of minorities in Afghanistan, which are completely in jeopardy, not to mention the fate of journalists who dare report anything that is even mildly adverse about the Taliban. Some women very courageously, I've been watching this on the BBC and elsewhere, have been protesting at considerable risk to their lives. But I think the women's rights, the rights of minorities, the rights of dissenters are all in considerable jeopardy in Afghanistan. And this should be a significant concern in all discussions with the Taliban. On the other hand, given their retrograde ideology, I think there are distinct limits on what can be done beyond holding their feet to the fire and saying that humanitarian and other forms of assistance may be in jeopardy unless the Taliban offer some assurances and some guarantees on these matters. But one should be extremely skeptical about their willingness to pay heed to these concerns.
With that, I would like to thank you, Professor Ganguly, for coming here, sharing your opinion and your knowledge with us. And we are truly honored to have you here. With that, yeah. With that, I would like to start with our second speaker for the webinar. And for that, I pass the mic to Vedahi. Over to you, Vedahi.
Thank you, Kavita. Now we will move to our next speaker, Ms. Suhasini Heather. Ms. Suhasini is an Indian print and television journalist. At present, she is the National Affairs and Diplomatic Affairs editor of The Hindu. She regularly writes on conflict and foreign policy issues with a focus on the Indian subcontinent. She has also written columns and articles in leading newspapers such as Business Standard and the Indian Express in the past. Her articles at The Hindu cover wide-range topics, including Indian foreign policy, international diplomacy, and global security challenges. She has covered many challenging stories and conflicts from Pakistan, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Syria, Libya, and Lebanon. She was also the foreign affairs editor and the prime-time anchor at CNN IBN from the year 2005 to 2014, where she presented her signature show, Worldview with Suhasini. Please note that the Q&A session will be conducted right after this. Till then, please drop your questions in the chat box below if you have any. With this, I'd now like to invite Ms. Suhasini. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Gargi College for organizing this and to Professor Shivit Ganguly for his very detailed explanation of not just the region, but how the United States is seeing the situation unfold in Afghanistan. I do want to start with that question that you asked right now about why women are left out. And I would point you not just to, the lip service that has been paid over the years to women who really in the last 20 years had benefited from the fall of the Taliban, had built careers in Afghanistan. And I would just point out that when the US signed an agreement with the Taliban on February 29th, 2020, it did not involve even one phrase about the rights of women and the rights of minorities in Afghanistan. A similar agreement was signed between the Taliban and what was called the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, the Ghani government. Again, didn't speak about these issues. What does this really mean? That nobody has actually asked the Taliban to make good on these on any kind of assurances that they would not backtrack on the rights of women that have been given. Even today, I will say, the international community has become like a frog, the proverbial frog that is in boiling water as far as the Taliban statements go, because one day the Taliban says women cannot come out. Next day they say maybe they can come out, but they have to wear certain kinds of dresses, or they have to be segregated from the men in college, or they have to be taught by older women or older men, by women or older men. And the international community seems to be okay with this. So the truth is, what is India doing? What is anyone when it comes to ensuring that there are these rights kept? Apart from making the point in fancy statements at multilateral conferences, nobody has said that this is our condition for allowing the Taliban to continue the way it is continuing. And the truth is, while there is this air of helplessness around about the fact that the Taliban has come back to power in Kabul, I will make the point that that is a logical outcome of the deal that the US signed in February 29, 2020. The US didn't say we are leaving Afghanistan and let the Afghans sort out their own affairs by themselves. The US said, we would like to leave Afghanistan in a year. We want guarantees of our own safety and that of our allies. And did not make the point that the Taliban should stop attacks on the Afghan National Forces, for example. So I do think that this idea that there was no question that the Taliban would come to power is something that needs to be contested. Let me come back to what you've asked me to speak about today, which is really how is India reacting and how is India affected by the Taliban takeover. To begin with, I will say that the scenario and the understanding of Indian experts has been that the situation, that the changes in Afghanistan reflect a very bleak outlook for India at the moment. Why do they say that? One is really that that you have a situation where a group has come to power in Afghanistan that has not actually been in talks, or that New Delhi has not been engaged with. There may have been talks behind the scenes. There's been one on the, a publicly acknowledged discussion between the Indian ambassador in Doha and the Taliban now Deputy Foreign Minister Stanizai. But that was a very limited engagement. The second is that the role of Pakistan seems to be extremely large in this new government. And Pakistan's made it very clear that they seek to cut India out of Afghanistan. Time and again, Pakistani statements have been about India's role in Afghanistan being detrimental to their security. So there is no question that that is going to be Pakistan's aim and goal in terms of using its leverage now with the new regime inside Afghanistan. Now, we saw the ISI chief, General Faiz actually show up in Kabul when it looked like the government was not being formed, giving us an indication that Pakistan is very intricately involved with the formation of the government in Kabul. And it is not the civilian structure of Pakistan, but the military structure of Pakistan that is involved. The third reason for this kind of pessimism, if you like, in New Delhi is that all of the global powers that were engaging Afghanistan, were engaging the Taliban for the future of Afghanistan. And I can name all of them, but the most important were the three: Russia, US, China. They have differences on every other issue. Russia and China are ranged against the US on every issue. But when it came to talking to the Taliban, what did they do? They formed the Troika, and then along with Pakistan formed the Troika Plus and held at least 6 meetings. We only found out about these in March this year, when the Troika Plus put out its first statement saying we have met on these occasions 6 times in the past. It did seem as if India was not only being cut out by these people, obviously not much expectation from China and Pakistan, but India did have expectations from both the United States and from Russia that India's interests would also be taken into account in these negotiations. And so therefore, you can only conclude India was misled by interlocutors coming from Moscow and coming from Washington when they spoke about what India's role would be in the future of Afghanistan. Fourth, I've already mentioned the Doha Agreement. What the US did with that agreement was essentially equate the Taliban to the government in Afghanistan. And since then, everything we've seen, and I agree with Professor Ganguly, you can't blame just the Biden administration. This began in the Trump administration with that agreement. But even Mr. Biden made a point, and he has said this publicly. He made a point, Mr. Blinken wrote to President Ghani to say, you need to step aside. You need to let a more inclusive government, by which they meant a government that included the Taliban, take power. And they still stand by that. I mean, it's not something, I'm not revealing something that is secret. That is what the US saw as the future of Afghanistan. So in a sense, there is this group, the Taliban, which 20 years ago, the US was at the forefront after the 9/11 attacks to put sanctions on them, to call them designated terrorists. 135 of them in all were put on that list. And in the last 2 years, we have seen the US, Russia, and China, all three members of the UN Security Council that put all these sanctions on them, basically work with the idea that not only were they going to engage with these very designated terrorists, that the country that had given them safe haven all these years, for 20 years, which is Pakistan, would actually be the conduit for them dealing with the Taliban, and that they were going to actually help a situation arise where the Taliban was in some form of shape in power in Kabul. Now, events may have overtaken everyone. Everyone may have been taken by surprise by the speed with which the Taliban took over, or the ANDSF, the Afghan National Forces, simply sublimated and disappeared. But this was a plan. And I think, again, for India, this is the worst possible outcome in that sense. The fourth is connectivity deals. Now, I'm not talking about the US necessarily, but the connectivity deals of the region have, in a way, come together where India is not an integral part of them. Why do I say this? 2 months ago in Tashkent, there was a conference on Central Asia, South Asia connectivity, focusing on Afghanistan. What came out of that was it looked like a connectivity network if you were to put all the patches together. So there is the Belt and Road Initiative that China runs, but it goes across Central Asia. There is the Trans-Afghan Railroad that Uzbekistan has been a part of building through Afghanistan. There is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor that China and Pakistan are building with Chinese money. There is the China-Iran Connectivity Corridor, that was the agreement for which was signed just last year. Finally, there is the Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan Transit Trade Agreement that essentially works for all of Central Asia to take goods through Central Asia, through Afghanistan, Pakistan, and out to the to the Bay of Bengal through Gwadar or Karachi. All of these connectivity networks essentially don't need India in them. And while India does have the Chabahar port and does have a route to Afghanistan through Iran, the fact is that with the Taliban government in power, that route might not be the one that everyone is working on anymore. So, so India's investments also have actually taken a hit in Afghanistan. Because what was India's investment? Its investment in Afghanistan have been threefold. One has been in democracy and the democratic process of Afghanistan. India was a part of the constitution being built. India was a part of helping elections being carried out. No matter what you think of those elections, there were 4 of them. India was a part of training the next generation of leaders in Afghanistan, political leaders in Afghanistan. And India was then part of this investment. And the investments that India made to begin with, the infrastructure investments they made, were some of the most ambitious ones. India built the parliament. That was a way of saying that India was invested in Afghan democracy. India built the Zaranj-Dilaram highway. One of the reasons was because they wanted this kind of network to be built that connected to Chabahar. India built 500 projects across 34 provinces that were essentially to help with development, water, all the rest of that, schools in Afghanistan. So there was a huge investment. So that is another reason why you see this kind of pessimism, as I said, in New Delhi. The funny part is that now we hear a lot of people in India saying, well, it doesn't really matter. What happens in Afghanistan doesn't bother India to the effect. All that we are worried about is the safety of Indians. Safety of Indians in Afghanistan, if there are any, or we will take them out. And most Indians have returned. Or the safety of Indians in India. So we need to ensure that no terrorism spillover happens, as we had seen in the 1990s. Now, the funny part is to hear people say that India really has no stakes in Afghanistan, because this is something other countries have tried to say over the decades, and India pushed back on. So in 1991, when the US first decided to pull out its stakes from Afghanistan because the war had been won, the Soviets had been defeated by this motley crew of and the collection of the Mujahideen, which were trained by Pakistan, funded by the US. The US essentially left the Afghan project to Pakistan at that time. India had made many suggestions, but the US essentially said, we are leaving, and this is, this is now Afghanistan's problem and Pakistan's problem to deal with. In 2001, when the 9/11 attacks had happened, and then there was a Bonn conference at the end of the year, the Indian team that came for negotiations, despite the fact that India had been such a backer of the Northern Alliance, did not even have a hotel room because they didn't feel that India should be a part of that discussion, and they fought their way into it. In 2011, when the US and UK decided to say that we need to do these talks with the Taliban, start the talks with the Taliban, and India was on another page entirely, said there is no good Taliban and bad Taliban, we have to with the Taliban as one entity. India was again cut out of that position, fought its way back. It became the first strategic partnership agreement that Afghanistan signed. In 2021, however, India is not fighting back. Instead, what we're seeing is a kind of strategic retreat in response to this scenario that I've just built for you that has happened in Afghanistan. So, some of the things we are seeing, for example, and I think Professor Roy referred to the problem of refugees. You referred to the problem, Kavita, I think, of women. Unlike the past, unlike the 1990s and 2001, this time India has not opened its doors for Afghan refugees wanting to come. In fact, India has only evacuated Indians and a small amount of Afghans who mainly are Afghan Sikhs and Hindus who have long-term visas for India. So in all, and this is MEA Ministry of External Affairs figures, India evacuated over a period of 2 weeks, India evacuated 565 people. That might seem like a lot, but when you compare that America, I think, took out 124,000 people, of which only about 5,000 were American citizens, you see the difference immediately. Of the 565 people that India evacuated, only about 112 were Afghans. The rest were Indian citizens or third countries. And of those Afghans, it's about 70 were, as I said, minorities. So there is a kind of retreat in what India is willing to do when it comes to Afghanistan. Why do we need to remain engaged? To begin with, it is not possible to say that the strategic threat from Afghanistan is essentially one of terrorism coming in. It's a much bigger threat. India today faces a two-front situation where both with the Chinese at the line of actual control and with the Pakistani army at the line of control, there is a tense situation. It is true that at the LOC we have a ceasefire agreement, but nobody knows how long that will hold. With the Chinese, we have a tense kind of impasse where Chinese troops have transgressed into Indian territory. Slowly, we are seeing a disengagement. It's not a complete disengagement. So when you have this kind of a strategic threat to your north and your west, to add to it the threat from an Afghanistan that is now ruled by the Taliban, which has not been friendly to India, and which now can become a safe haven for terror groups that target India, we are looking at a threat umbrella over India's head that India has to think about. And it is not possible to say we are disengaged from this idea. The second, of course, and I mentioned to you the ambitious projects, the bank of goodwill that India has had with Afghan citizens is not something India can walk away from. Over the years, year upon year, India brought in thousands of Afghanistan's next generation, if you like, those who were just, little kids when the Taliban was defeated the last time in 2001. India has brought others like military soldiers who have been trained in Indian institutions, doctors, professionals. All kinds of Afghans have trained over here, gone back to Afghanistan and contributed to their society. India does have that bank of goodwill. It would be an extreme shame if we were to, because of a regime change, walk away from Afghans who have time and again, if you looked at surveys, time and again, India would come up top of the charts when it came to goodwill. Amongst those is that new generation, as I said, media, professionals, artists, activists. And then finally, the point that you had made, India does have a stake in the treatment of women and minorities and in ensuring human rights are kept in Afghanistan, simply because, as I said, India had an investment in a democratic Afghanistan. And democracy doesn't just mean elections. It means representation. It means equality for all. It means, rights for all, basic freedoms for all. So what are the options? And I'll stop after that. To just give you an idea of what India can do at this point with this very bleak scenario and this kind of strategic retreat that we are seeing. The first is, of course, India has a big role to play at the United Nations. Obviously, in the next month, in the next couple of weeks, we will see a lot of these questions being answered. To begin with, there is the question of who gets to sit in Afghanistan's seat at the United Nations. It looks at the moment as if the Taliban's nominee, who has not yet been suggested or proposed, is not going to get the seat immediately, because Myanmar is ahead in the queue, and the UN doesn't seem to be recognizing the Myanmarese junta who took over power in February. The second place where India will play a role is the UN Security Council. We saw them a part of the discussions over August. The third place is India is the chairperson of the Taliban Sanctions Committee. And here it's very interesting because the US has actually asked that the sanctions against many of the Taliban leaders that had been waived while they were part of peace talks, so people like Baradar, like Stanexai, should actually be extended. Now that is quite a surprise because the US doesn't at present have any stake in this Afghan reconciliation process. Formally, they're not talking about it. And the Afghans themselves are not talking about reconciliation anymore. They're just talking about government formation and now presenting that as a fait accompli. So it's interesting that the US and presumably Russia and China as well want these sanction waivers on Taliban leaders to be extended at least until December. And the sanctions waivers mean that they have access to travel and they have access to funds. There will be an asset defreeze so that they can pay for this travel. Of course, it is couched in the language that it must be for peace and reconciliation efforts. But India has an important role to play over there and whether to allow this to go through or not, whether to schedule the meetings and so forth. There is the UN assistance mission in Afghanistan, UNAMA, whose mandate expires today. And the question is, what kind of a role will the UN play in the future of Afghanistan? And then we are seeing today there's an SCO meeting, there are meetings where Afghanistan is a big part and India has a leadership role to play. Second place is on the subject of refugees. I still think it isn't too late for India to make it clear that they would like to bring in as many Afghans who would like to come to India. Remember, in a few days after the Kabul takeover, the government announced something called an e-visa and said anyone who wants to come from Afghanistan, we know you can't present your passports physically because we don't have an embassy in Afghanistan. Please apply for e-visas. However, none of those e-visas have actually been given out so far. Not just that, the government decided to actually cancel all the previous visas that had been given to Afghans over the years or in the last few weeks. So that's one place where India can play a role, become a much more large-hearted, open country at this time of Afghanistan's need. For those who need to come here for a short while, who need a safe place to come to, perhaps conduct business and so forth. The third is that there is an engagement with the Taliban, and India's role over there is important. The Taliban has shown that it is interested in recognition. The Taliban has made statements that it is interested, it is keen to engage with India, it is keen to do trade with India. That is a point of leverage that must be thought about. You know, about 10 years ago, there was this Italian writer who I would urge you to read on the Taliban called Antonio Giustozzi. And he said that the real problem is that you do need to engage with the Taliban. The question is the timing. You have to ensure that you remain engaged with the Taliban when, the optimal time is when the Taliban feels pressure and feels the need to talk, but still has enough command and control over its men to effectively put in, a ceasefire or a lack of violence and that sort of thing. Now, obviously, we've gone a few steps ahead from those 10 years ago, but that the things remains the same, that while the Taliban feels international pressure, that is when you need to speak with them, but making sure that they are actually in control of anything. I find it interesting that today everyone says the real threat is ISIS. But if the real threat is ISIS, then why was the whole world engaging the Taliban? What was the Taliban supposed to give you if they could not effect a proper ceasefire? In fact, I don't think that there's that many differences. And the Taliban does seem to have some kind of command and control structure over the violence, but that becomes a violence veto. And the world cannot succumb to that. And finally, and I will leave it here, and I'm sure there will be those of you who don't agree with me on this, that an engagement with Afghanistan does seem, especially at this moment, rather fruitless if India is not also going to engage Pakistan. We are in a situation where we have no talks with Pakistan, no trade with Pakistan, we have no people-to-people ties with Pakistan, and there is absolutely no engagement at any levels. We've cut off all ties for various reasons. Pakistan has cut some of the ties, India has cut some of the ties. The result is that there is absolutely no trade, no connectivity, no economic activity between the two. It is not inconceivable that we could possibly, move in on transit. I'm sorry.
Ma'am, request whoever it is to please unmute, to mute yourself. The lecture is still going on.
I'll just continue. Thank you. So I do think that at some point India will have to look at this as well. But I think the basic gist of what I really am trying to say over here is that it is not possible, regardless of the grim situation that India sees today in Afghanistan, the fear one has of violence reaching India. It is not possible to disengage. India is going to have to live with its geography. There are many countries who are today building a stake in Afghanistan who can fly off. who can live apart from Afghanistan. But at the end of the day, at least the map that we draw of India actually touches Afghanistan. And it is impossible for India to feel they can immunize themselves and be untouched by developments. I'll leave it.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think that must have helped students to create a better perspective and derive a better understanding of the crisis. So, first of all, of course, the crisis is sensitive and we need immediate attention to the crisis. Since Taliban took power in Afghanistan, the humanitarian emergency has become even more dire. The focus is now shifting to a much larger multifaceted humanitarian crisis, right? Like in terms of the refugee crisis, as you have talked about, and how India is ignoring a very pertinent issue right now, which is like, siding themselves and thinking that probably this, we Indians don't really have to associate with the region because, we only have to take Indian out of the Afghanistan, but that is not how the diplomacy could work, because as you have said the word yeah,
Retreat.
yeah, exactly, strategic retreat, right? Thank you so much, ma'am. So ma'am, we moving ahead, there are certain questions we would be very happy if you could address. There are certain questions in the chat box as well, which I would read, of course, but we have certain questions via mail also. So I'll just read it out. China has been vocal about its support for the Taliban. How would that support affect not only the world order, but also China's race to become the next superpower? What are you
Should I?
on that, ma'am?
Yeah. There's no question that China has shown in the last few years that they are not only willing to engage the Taliban, but that they see a future role in Afghanistan. So we have seen some of their investments, and I think Professor Ganguly referred to, China's interest in rare earth minerals that is believed to be found in Afghanistan. China is interested in the connectivity structure. Therefore, has put money in with even the Uzbek railroad project. China does have a suggestion to extend the CPEC. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor right now goes through Pakistan-occupied Kashmir to Xinjiang. But one offshoot of it, according to Chinese officials, could become basically what is called PACEX, Pakistan, Afghanistan, China Economic Corridor. So you can see China getting involved in many ways. And finally, they have their route not only to Central Asia, but also to Iran, which will become part of a larger network. How will this affect? Look, at the beginning, it does look as if China could, increase its footprint completely over this region. On the other hand, China has always been very conservative when it comes to actually putting money into something. Even just now, if you looked at the humanitarian conference in Geneva, China basically offered about $30 million. The US, which has said that it is left Afghanistan, actually offered double that. So China is conservative when it comes to actually putting money. They bought the rights to copper mines and other mines in Afghanistan. They haven't started anything on it. Unlike India, which built the Zaranj-Dilaram highway at great cost to us and great cost of lives to us as well. China has not tried to build its roadways across Afghanistan yet. Question is, how much will China feel obligated to do? Because after a while, if you break it, you own the problem. And there is no question that if the Taliban is seen as a Pakistani subordinate in some ways, Pakistan is seen as hugely indebted to China. And in a sense, the success of this entire project depends on stability and the lack of violence in Afghanistan. Because after all, Afghanistan is the center point of all these places. Final point for China is that its Belt and Road Initiative can only be successful if the exit point on the continent in China remains stable. And that exit point is Xinjiang. If all trade on the land route, sea route, on the land route has to go through Xinjiang, then China has to look at Afghanistan very closely to ensure that none of the terrorism, the radicalization spills over into Xinjiang, which is a Muslim majority. And Professor Ganguly spoke about some of the very repressive methods China has used on the Uyghur population there. So I think China is looking to be much more involved, is looking to assert its leadership in the region, if you like. But it's not going to be an easy thing, and I think it will have a mixed basket of goals over there.
Right, ma'am. Thank you so much. I mean, that really stands to the fact that how China is getting diplomatically involved in the crisis, and because of the region, also South Asia region, China is already trying to be the superpower in the region. So, ma'am, I'll just get back to you. There's one specific question for Professor Sumit Ganguly, which I'd like to address. So the question goes, with your permission, sir. Can India use its ties with Gulf countries for its strategic interest in Afghanistan? Also, Pakistan and China have no doubt welcomed the Taliban takeover, but countries like Iran or Turkey are skeptical of new regime. Specifically, can India afford to engage with Iran over Afghanistan, which definitely US would never like?
Right. There are a number of questions embedded in that one question, and I'll try and answer them. Obviously, India should use whatever influence it has in the Gulf, which it has been building up over some time, and it actually even precedes the current government. But the current government certainly has made significant efforts to build up its ties with the Gulf countries, and obviously, to the extent that it's possible to use that influence to work to obtain a kind of a foothold in Afghanistan, India certainly should. And regardless of what the US thinks, and this administration is less likely to be so hostile to any Indian overture towards Iran, unlike the Trump administration, which had pursued this policy of maximum pressure and had sought to completely isolate Iran, and it had imposed an entirely new raft of sanctions on Iran. The Biden administration is keen on reviving the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action, and has started discussions with Iran. So I don't think it's going to face the same kind of hostility that it would have encountered, the unreasoning hostility it would have encountered under the Trump administration. So it is possible, as long as India keeps the US informed of these overtures, I think it's possible to work with Iran without incurring the wrath of the United States. And I am not convinced that Turkey is so averse to the regime in Afghanistan. In fact, Turkey has even offered to run the Hamid Karzai International Airport, since the Taliban themselves don't have the technical capacity to run the airport. The Iranians, on the other hand, are much more skeptical of the Taliban regime, and recent statements from Iran certainly indicate that. And consequently, it makes sense for India to quietly engage with Iran on the question of Afghanistan.
Right, sir. Thank you so much. So it completely, actually, it explains why the involvement of India with the Gulf countries is limited, because India is certainly aligning or maybe inclining towards the superpowers right now. So, ma'am, there is this question. There are multiple questions, of course, but it addresses the point which you were talking about in the how India should take a firm action in the United Nations. So, ma'am, there are a few questions which addresses that particular point, which says that what is the role of United Nations Security Council in ongoing crises in Afghanistan are? And the other question is somehow related, which says that why United Nations is lacking a stern action towards the humanitarian crisis grimming up in the region of Afghanistan.
Right. Well, the United Nations, remember, in the Security Council, which is considered the most powerful body in the world, is basically made up of the power of its constituents. In other words, it has to be the P5 in the UN Security Council, which is US, Russia, China, UK, and France, who are committed to doing something over there, and then actions can follow. What are the actions that can follow? As I said, the UN could give real teeth to its mission in Afghanistan, the UNAMA mission, and ensure that the UN personnel are guaranteed security by the Taliban regime, that their personnel are allowed to monitor the humanitarian situation, are allowed to monitor the condition of human rights in the country. So those guarantees have to be guarantees for safe passage, the way out for Afghan in the country. That's one place the UN can go. There are various other measures that lead up to finally what are called Chapter 7 sort of declarations, which, or is it Chapter 8, that deal with intervention. But that intervention, of course, depends on UN Security Council members. And right now, there's no appetite for that. There seems to be also a kind of fatigue, a donor fatigue in the world when it comes to dealing with, the situation in Afghanistan, the humanitarian crisis. Then there is a fatigue when it comes to refugees. So these are the big problems and the challenges before the UN as it is coming out of a pandemic, as the world is coming out of all kinds of other conflicts. The fact is that there isn't too much of a bandwidth dealing with yet another conflict and dealing with Afghanistan. Every country feels bad about what can possibly happen there and what is happening over there, but it's very limited what each country really wants to do.
But can I leave? Can I leave? Okay, moving ahead, ma'am. Okay, so this question is, of course, not any speaker dependent, but there is this question which I think could be important since we are discussing this very immediate issue. So this draws parallel to the history of the crisis, which says, drawing parallel to the history back in 1989, the Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan. And after 2 years, the USSR disintegrated. So is the United States withdrawal similar to the Soviet withdrawal back in 1989?
Is that question for me?
Ma'am, this is a speaker independent, but of course, if you want to take up, please go ahead.
So, Asi, if you could take that question.
Yeah, right.
Also, the fact that about $1 billion have been pledged, how do we ensure that actually that $1 billion worth of aid, which has been pledged to the United Nations, how do we ensure that it actually is going to reach the people who need it? The Afghan people really are in dire straits. They need all the help that they can get. But how do we get them the money? How do we ensure a safe package for the UN people? They were attacked. The Haqqani network, if you remember, they already attacked the United Nations. They're very vulnerable.
I think that's a very important question, because eventually it is the economics of Afghanistan that is going to, really lead to a greater crisis in the country. Because remember, Afghanistan depends on debt and assistance from abroad, and needs about $6 billion really just to get through every year. At present, not only is that money not coming in, there have been asset freezes. So the IMF, for example, has not just, it's not just the UN that has these sanctions, but the IMF has frozen assets for the movement. Also, you add to it that the Taliban's peculiar and brutal form of government includes not allowing women to come into work. So you're cutting out 30 to 40% of your workforce for the government right there. Those who work in the government are themselves scared to go to work, and they have not been paid salaries for the last 3 months. So we are looking at a very dire situation. So you speak about that 1 billion that has been pledged, that might come with strings attached, but how can someone ensure that they will get to distribute that money on their own and not give it to a government that is already, several billion dollars behind when it comes to governing? Eventually, if Afghanistan is ungovernable, the fear is it will go back to a greater civil war situation than perhaps it has seen over the last 20 years. In that sense, everything is extremely precarious. It may seem right now that, on the surface that there isn't violence, that there isn't trouble, but just below the surface, there are all the seeds for a future conflict and real worries. I mean, even within the Taliban government, if you were to stretch your imagination and accept that the Taliban actually can run a government, which I am not quite sure of, there are so many contradictions within the government. They have the Haqqanis in a position of power who are out and out a terror group. They're wanted for the attacks on the Indian embassies as well. And they're in 3 ministries over there. 17 of the 33 are sanctioned terrorists. Are these the people then who are going to rule the country? What happens to the fact that the Taliban made many promises on how it would work when it came to power, if it came to power in Afghanistan? Those promises were made by leaders whom we see nowhere. Abdul Ghani Baradar, for example, he's been out of the picture. Stanigzai, for example, he's been made a deputy foreign minister, doesn't seem to have much power in this structure. So where is that structure lying? I think all of these are part of the question that you have asked, and to the gentleman who asked, or the lady who asked the question earlier about whether the US will face the blowback, I don't think so. Because all said and done, the US's pullout has been near, it's been completed now without any of those repercussions. There is also a full support, if you ask me, in the United States. There's criticism of the way the Biden administration went about it. But the support for a pullout from Afghanistan is across the both sides, and you can see that from the kind of Senate hearings we've seen and the Congress HFAC hearings we have seen. The administration, the Biden administration, not really faced that many questions about actually pulling out of Afghanistan. The Soviets had a different problem. They had an economic problem after their Afghan misadventure, and they had a problem of an already loose federation of states that saw this as an opportunity. And then you had other problems within the Soviet. I mean, this is not the time to go into what happened in the Soviet Union and broke it up, but essentially their economic reforms, the unpopularity of their leaders, a complete breakdown really is what led to the breakup. I think Afghanistan was the kind of, the flare gun, if you like. At the point, I don't think it's comparable to the situation in the States.
I completely agree with everything Suhasini said in terms of the comparison with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There are structural dissimilarities between the two. The Soviet Union was already on the verge of collapse. It was faced with fundamental economic crises, and Mikhail Gorbachev, in fact, referred to Afghanistan as a bleeding wound before he withdrew from Afghanistan. And this was sort of the final straw that broke the camel's back. The US economy, while it has taken a hit from COVID, is still quite robust. I am hopeful, despite the hostility of the Republicans, that Biden will be able to pass a substantial portion of his $3.5 trillion recovery program, which should remake the American economy. And while inflation remains a concern, it is still manageable in the United States. And consequently, I think the comparison with the Soviet Union is really completely inapt. And I think the US will continue to thrive as a country.
Right, sir. I think that extremely addresses the question where the student had asked, will there be the same consequences with United States as well? Also, sir, there's a specific question for you. What will you say about the rising terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and others, maybe under the veil of Taliban, as in a way that the support to Taliban by China and Pakistan is facilitating the rise of such terrorist groups? How will it impact US, China, and Pakistan?
Well, let me start from Pakistan. Pakistan, as long as these terrorist groups direct their fire towards India, the Pakistanis could care less. In fact, they would welcome the continuation of these groups and maintain plausible deniability that they have nothing to do with this. These are indigenous organizations that are hostile to India and are responding to Indian repression in Kashmir. That would be the Pakistani argument, which has been the standard Pakistani argument. So Pakistan is not going to see this as inimical to its interests. Al-Qaeda is a different matter. because if Al-Qaeda directs its fire against Pakistan, that could become a concern. The Tehrik-e-Taliban is a concern for Pakistan. So it depends on which terrorist groups one is talking about. That will in many ways shape Pakistan's agenda towards various terrorist groups operating from within Afghanistan. In terms of the United States, Biden has made it clear that he intends to use what he refers to as over-the-horizon capabilities, military capabilities located primarily in the Gulf, which could be used to strike against terrorist groups in Afghanistan. And the US will do this because it has the requisite firepower and can do this without much fear about adverse international reactions. And even if there are adverse international reactions, the US is powerful enough to shrug them off. And that will remain a significant concern of the Biden administration because it has told the American people repeatedly that it can protect the homeland and American assets globally despite the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So significant US intelligence and military capabilities will be devoted to addressing this issue of renewed terrorism directed against the United States. And as far as China is concerned, as I mentioned, as long as the ETIM does not rear its head or in any way gets seriously involved in Xinjiang, the Chinese could care less about terrorism because it does not directly affect them. And Al-Qaeda does not seem to have targeted China. So they are indifferent to the rise of Al-Qaeda.
Right, sir. I think that actually states the fact that how, terrorist organizations can impact these countries. So thank you, sir. So ma'am, there's a specific question for you, which a lot of students have asked, but I'd like to rephrase a bit because, that way a lot of questions can be addressed together. So ma'am, according to you, what will be the impact of the current plight of Afghanistan on the freedom of press as the establishment of democratic standards in context to the Indian media as well? How will you think this current scenario will impact Indian media as well as the media worldwide? Because since you are the eminent personality in the field, I'd like you to comment on this particular question.
So to begin with, in Afghanistan, of course, the situation for journalists has become, very, very dire. Even the best Afghan media outlets like Tohu News, Ariana, are all considering whether they need to shut down. In the first few days after the Taliban took over Kabul, they made all kinds of gestures. The Taliban went into studios, spoke to women who were not veiled. It seemed they were going one way. But now that seems to have been a charade. And they are actively stopping journalists from reporting, threatening other journalists. And we have seen over the last month some of the best journalists in Afghanistan having to leave. International media remains over there, but in a very secured kind of atmosphere, mostly in the Sirina Hotel, and as much as they can do outside of that, which means really that the fear that Afghanistan will come under not just a Taliban sort of, a conservative regime, but a totalitarian. And that is a state of concern for everyone, because we saw what happened in the years from 1996 to 2001. How does it extrapolate around the world? I think the real problem is, as I said, it's like donor fatigue. It is a fatigue around the world where human rights are being assailed, where authoritarian powers, even democratically elected totalitarian leaders, are taking advantage of the lack of caring in the world to carry out policies they want, to crack down on people they want to crack down on, to stifle criticism across the world. And this only feeds into that there is nothing you can do. At the end of the day, the Taliban has control. They have to be able to, they're running the country. What can anyone do? And that what can anyone do, which was the opposite of the time when the UN came into existence, which is why I believe that there must be a rethink of what we need as a world body there, has now spread around the world. So long as a country keeps its problems within its borders, everybody is able to move on. And there's no better example of that than Myanmar. In February, the junta took over, put an entirely newly elected government in prison. They have slapped them with the worst kind of cases, including a Nobel laureate, Aung San Suu Kyi. Slapped them with these cases of sedition, anti-national interest. Some of them could face death penalties, despite being a democratically elected government. And what has the world done? We haven't even seen the kind of sanctions we saw in the past on Myanmar being put in over there, because there is no cohesion in the world. There is such a polarization between the US on one side, the US and its allies on one side, Russia and China on the other, that the UN can't go forward. So that's a very long answer to your question. I think what happens in Afghanistan just adds to the already darkening, if you like, of democracy around the world, at a time when even democratically elected governments feel the immunity from actually having to carry out. Democracy has become just about elections, as I said, but it's about so much more. It's about representation. It's about fundamental freedoms. It's about human rights for all. It's about equality for every citizen. Minority rights. All of that is also a part of democracy. It's become that much easier to forget about.
It's about dissent.
The right to dissent, absolutely.
We lost our very own Danish Siddiqui also. In what happened in Afghanistan, and what has been your own personal experience in terms of covering these ravaged theaters of war? You have such great experience covering such situations. So could you share some of your own personal narratives for the students? They were very keen on knowing how it is to be a journalist in such a scenario. It takes guts.
I think the difference between what it was like in the past, and I have covered Kashmir, I've covered Sri Lanka, I've covered Libya, Syria, Lebanon, all during these conflict situations. And the difference really from about 10 years ago, even up till about 10 years ago, is that today the journalist is seen as fair game. There was a time when journalists were seen as outside of the conflict. And even rebel groups, even terrorist groups would want to bring their voice out by speaking to journalists. Journalists kind of were seen as neutral participants and somebody who should not be targeted. I think that idea has completely changed. And when journalists go in, they are already seen as partisan, as biased, and as fair game. ISIS, for example, used to kidnap journalists on purpose. Al-Qaeda did it too. Kidnap journalists on purpose because they realized that when they kidnapped them or even brutally executed them, that would be picked up much more by media organizations. So in a sense, a journalist became fair game. So now what is happening is journalists can only go into conflict situations if their security is guaranteed. And as a result, for example, we did not send somebody to cover the fall of Kabul. We can think about that discussion later, but you can see that not many Indian outfits were there, and the few that were there pulled out very quickly, especially after what happened to Danish, because first, to begin with, in a conflict like Afghanistan, Indians become a specific target because of other agencies that are working in Afghanistan. The second point is that, you don't have that kind of, I've worked with an international agency. When you went into conflict situations, you had your own security professionals. It doesn't mean that you went with armed guards, because journalists do not travel with armed guards, but you had people to consult who would tell you about the safety of a certain assignment, of which way to go, what route to take. All of those things are what an international agency can afford, and you can see that those are the agencies that are today operating out of Afghanistan. The final thing is the interest of a country in a story. And this is something journalists today really have to battle against, that it is now possible for people to just switch off from conflicts around the world. There's so much misery in the world that there is just no interest now. It's like, give me the good news. because I can't take this anymore. And I think that's something journalists do have to struggle against. Finally, I will say that these are depressing times. But look at the places, it's not just about violence. Conflict in a country also is the crushing of dissent, as you pointed out, the crushing of free speech, the crackdowns on journalists, on NGOs, media organizations. We talk about a lot of these crackdowns that happen, but look at even in Jammu and Kashmir, we have become used to the idea that national security somehow becomes the cover for any state action. And that is something our journalists are facing. There is a journalist who went to cover a rape case in Uttar Pradesh, who is still in jail more than a year later. There are journalists who have had raids on their offices just in the last month. Why? Because they were slightly critical. One of them just because they almost, it was over a comedy show. There are journalists who have been put on Pegasus software lists specifically because of one story they did or another story. Does that merit a complete lack of their privacy, breaking into their phones and all the rest of that? So we all operate, and India is by no means the worst of these countries that I've just discussed by conflict. It's all operate in a kind of conflict today, and I think that there must be some thought given to what you want to do as a journalist, because around the world it's become very easy to become the kind of journalist that plays safe, if you like. So when you ask me about working in conflicts, I'm not sure we are all living in a conflict situation as journalists around the world.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We have Miss Kavita who would like to ask a question. So, Miss Kavita, please go ahead.
Yeah. There's this one last question to you, Suhasini, and also to if Professor Ganguly wants to address this. This is in general about the structure of how international relations is shaped, in the sense, what is it about the structure of international relations that it is still dominated by a particular meaning of security and power politics, that it always so happens that the issue of women rights and human rights are actually relegated to the sidelines when the actual time comes. And so how do we address that situation? So I think the Afghan crisis definitely brings this particular issue into limelight again, that what is it about the structure of international relations, how it is shaped and constructed, that we face this thing again and again. And with that, I would like to thank both our speakers for from the Kutniti side, that they have come here and given the precious time to deliberate on this important topic and share their informed opinion in general. Thanks a lot.
Suhasini, do you want to go first?
I think, Professor Ganguly, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
Okay, thanks. I have two responses to that question. Yes, historically, issues of human security and questions of women's rights have not been at the front and center of the study or the practice of international politics. However, in the last couple of decades, certainly in the field of the study of international relations, the questions of human security, the questions of women's rights, a whole body of literature on feminism and international relations has emerged. And consequently, I don't think it is quite as marginal as you have characterized it. In terms of the practice of international politics, yes, there is a great deal of lip service that is paid to women's rights, but certainly at the same time, we have seen a proliferation of human rights organizations, of non-governmental organizations that, at least at the margins, are making a good faith effort to address this vital issue and to focus on questions of gender equality throughout the world. Gender equality, of course, is appalling, or the lack of gender equality is appalling in most places in the world, including here in the United States. But nevertheless, This is an item that has emerged on the global agenda, and it is being addressed. Are there considerable shortcomings? Is there a significant gap between rhetoric and reality? Absolutely. But I no longer think we are quite in the dark ages. I think we are making progress. The progress is incremental. The progress is slow. The progress is highly uneven. But nevertheless, I think there is a global movement, and I think it is unstoppable at this point, both in terms of the study of international relations and the practice of international relations. Though I'll be the first one to admit that we have a long, hard slog ahead of us.
Ma'am, you're not audible.
You are on mute.
Just to add one last point, Professor Ganguly, only 18% of world's top leadership is women leadership. Out of the entire leadership in the world, only 18% are women. So I think gender mainstreaming as far as foreign policy is a need of the hour. In India, this is much lesser. It's only 16%. So I think gender mainstreaming we need to do. There's a long road that we need to cover.
No, there's no debate on that subject whatsoever.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. So Hasni, would you like to take that?
No, I mean, I think what Professor Ganguly has said really sums it up. Everything is a work in progress, and everything is going to need for people to continue to engage with it. And that's, again, another reason why I feel, that the current situation with Afghanistan in particular, where there is this idea that we can all just, kind of move on from it, is a huge mistake, and the world will suffer as the world has suffered in the past when they try to sort of put a problem behind them and move on. Because these are times when you're in that very weird situation where if you walk away from Afghanistan, the situation could get that much worse than if you remain engaged with it. But remaining engaged with it, in a sense, leaves you open to the criticism that you are engaging essentially with terrorists. So somewhere there, those combined pressures and leverages of the entire world have to be made to work. You cannot have a situation where some countries are engaging freely and other countries are boycotting, if you like, the situation or just walking away from it. And I think that's why the United Nations was created, and that's why a world body needs to weigh in on these issues.
Thank you so much, ma'am. There are plenty of questions in the comment section, if you can see. But of course, we have time crunch, and we'll have to proceed with the vote of thanks. So, ma'am, thank you so much. Thank you, sir, for your responses. I think have made our students create a better perspective and derive a better understanding of the issue now. They are more learned. So, all thanks to you. So with that, I'd like to invite my fellow coordinator, Vedhi, for a vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Kritanjali. Now, I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you from the Department of Political Science, Gargi College, to our esteemed speakers for this enlightening session. Thank you, Professor Sumit Ganguly and Ms. Suhasini Heather, for sharing your insightful and thought-provoking views with us. The question and answer session was indeed very illuminating. It gave us deep insights into the topic and also revealed some interesting facts. We thank you for your valuable time and inputs. I'm positive that the entire student community and all the webinar attendees will benefit from your discourse today. Organizing this international webinar would not have been possible without the undividing support of the Kutniti. I would like to thank Ms. Amrita Dhillon, Mr. Amit Sinha, and Ms. Kavita. We extend our sincere gratitude to the organization. We thank Professor Pramila Kumar, Principal of our Gargi College, for her immense and unstinting support. I would also like to thank our teacher in charge, Dr. Manisha Roy, Association in charges, Dr. Seema Sharma, and Mr. Devraj Singh for presenting us with this opportunity, and the faculty members of our department. We are grateful to Mr. Anuj Bhadawaj and the support staff on the technical team for making sure that the event went along smoothly and was successful. Lastly, I would also like to extend my gratitude to the faculty the union, and all the students who graced us with their presence this evening and helped make this event fruitful and engaging for everyone present. I would now request all the attendees to please switch on their cameras for a group picture. All right. Thank you. Until we see you again.
Thank you very much,
Thank you, Professor
everyone.
Ganguly and Ms. Heather. It was really, really, really very illuminating. It was a wonderful, wonderful, very engaging discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me along with Professor Ganguly, who is such an expert on the subject.
No, this was a real pleasure to be on with Suhasini, and it's a pity it couldn't be in person. That's my only regret.
Hopefully soon.
Oh, God willing, soon.
Inshallah, as they say.
Inshallah.
Thanks very
Thank you,
much.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take care and bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Until we meet again.
Of course, in person.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.